to say welcome to the third session of the Royal Holloway Centre for Continental Philosophy talk series. So today we've got Professor Rebecca Bamford, who's a professor of philosophy at Quinnipiac University. So she's co-author with Keith Ansel Pearson of Nietzsche's Dawn, Philosophy, Ethics and the Passion of Knowledge that came out last year, is that right?
That's right.
And editor of Nietzsche's Free Spirit Philosophy from 2015. And she's also published a number of articles on Nietzsche's philosophy and bioethics. So she's presenting today a cut down paper that's going to be presented in a book that she's producing with Ali Merrick for SUNY Press called Nietzsche and Politicized Identities. And the paper is called Nietzsche, the Ethical and Disability.
Thank you. So let me start off just by giving everyone an outline of the talk. And I'll keep checking in with you about this as we go on. So I want to start off with a few words of thanks, which I'll get to in a minute. I'm going to describe the grounding questions for the larger version of this project. I'll introduce people to some key concepts from contemporary philosophy of disability. I'm then going to spend quite a bit of time discussing some work by Susan Stocker, who's written previously about Nietzsche and disability in a paper that I find both very helpful in some ways and also that raises some questions for me. So in responding to Stocker, I'm going to develop some thoughts on customary morality and Nietzsche's critique of Mitleid, and connect these to some thoughts about power relations. And I know I promised in my abstract for this talk a discussion of will to power as well, but I'm a bit worried that there's just not quite enough time to do all of that. So perhaps that's something we can talk about in Q&A. I also, towards the end, make some remarks about Nietzsche's ableism and Nietzschean ableism as potential concerns for this kind of project. And we'll introduce people to two ways of kind of addressing some of those concerns. And in conclusion, I'm going to think a little bit with you about customary morality and the critique of Mitleid as part of that, as the source of something that Joel Michael Reynolds has termed the ableist conflation, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute. So that's roughly what I'm going to do for the next 45 minutes or so. So I said I'd begin with some thanks and acknowledgements. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Henry Summers Hall, who's the director of the Centre for Continental Philosophy at Royal Holloway, and to all of his colleagues for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very grateful, actually, because this is a very helpful opportunity for me to start building from my last book project with Keith Ansel Pearson in a direction, as Henry mentioned, that I'm hoping to work in with regard to politicized identities and Nietzsche's work. Just also then to acknowledge both the recent book publication, Nietzsche's Dawn, Philosophy, Ethics and the Passion of Knowledge, and also my co-author, Keith Ansel Pearson of the University of Warwick. I am discussing some of the material from the book in this talk. And as I said, trying to build a little bit beyond that in the direction of understanding and thinking about disability in hopefully a liberatory and affirming way. So with that said, let me talk a little bit about the grounding questions for the wider project that I'm interested in. So this paper is part of a larger project of which my essay for Ali Merrick and my SUNY Press project is one piece. So what I'm interested in is developing a Nietzschean account of non-normate embodiment, and this is also Joel Michael Reynolds' term. So we could think of embodiment and disability as the nexus around which I'm talking when I use the phrase non-normate embodiment. I'm going to define that term in a minute in more depth. So I'm thinking through the investigation of several interlinked questions. But I wanted to note at the beginning that this project has been gestating. I've been ruminating upon it as I've been relearning how to walk following my second serious joint injury. And for people who might not know me personally, what's informing my interest in philosophy of disability is both chronic pain and joint problems that result from two serious injuries, one of which I sustained in 2001 when I was a graduate student, and one in 2018. And so my experience of living with these injuries and their changing consequences over the years has necessitated that I engage with several questions that have been developed through what is ongoing, but yet at the same time interrupted by the pandemic, experience of a need for physical therapy, and spending, I would say, around 4 to 6 hours a week doing physical therapy until the pandemic, most weeks since 2018, has non-trivially shaped my thinking in a number of ways, including with regard to my interest in the philosophy of disability. And here I want to note some work by Tommy J. Curry, who I saw give an amazing paper actually a few years ago on disability in physical therapy. And it's my sense that there's a lot to say actually about physical therapy, or physiotherapy as we say in the UK, and philosophy that hasn't always been attended to perhaps as much as it might have been. And so I'm grateful to Tommy Curry for starting me thinking about that more seriously. So in this wider project, I'm pursuing an understanding of what Joel Michael Reynolds in a 2018 paper has termed non-normate embodiment. And I'm investigating several interlinked questions, which hopefully you can see on the screen here. How is an injury something in and through which one also at the same time expresses strength? Secondly, how can we understand a non-normate body as a strong body? And there are some reasons why there have been challenges with that, as I'll discuss presently. And thirdly, and this is really the question that I'm starting with in this presentation today, might a Nietzschean account of the ethical be helpful in some way to the wider goal of tackling ableism in philosophy and more generally? So in what follows here, I'm going to explore what resources are contained in Nietzsche's philosophy that may help us to respond to this third question. And I should note that I'm going to use identity first language, so referring to disabled people, rather than people first language, so people with disabilities, primarily because many of the philosophers of disability whose work I've been reading and paying attention to have tended to take that path. And I'd also note that although I don't think I will have space in this talk to discuss particular disability issues, I do plan in the wider project to include intellectual and cognitive disabilities as well as physical disabilities. Again, a preamble comment. It bears mention here that an increasing number of scholars have been developing worthwhile critical engagements with the concept of health in Nietzsche's thought. And this is work that has actually been done for quite a while. So Mary Rawlinson, Scott Podolsky and Fred Tauber, and then John Richardson, Jessica Berry, Melanie Shepherd, more recently Andrew Huddleston and Ian Dunkel have written about health. I've also written about this myself. Kristen Brown Golden and Ros Diprose have also written very helpfully, as I'm sure many of you know, about Nietzsche and embodiment. In Brown Golden's case, her 2006 book does discuss disability, but she, even though she's writing primarily about Nietzsche, she tends to discuss disability through the lens of Merleau-Ponty's writing, rather more so than she does with respect to Nietzsche. I do think that ultimately there will be closer overlap between these areas of available scholarship and my current project. But in this talk, I want to focus on disability in relation to the following very specific aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy. So his critique of customary morality, his critique of Mitleid, and his thinking on power. And the reason I want to focus rather on those areas to start with is I'm trying to open up some space to really focus on ways of connecting Nietzsche's philosophy with work that's being done in the contemporary philosophy of disability. My worry was that if I start with health, if I start even on embodiment and thinking about normate embodiment first, I run the risk of not centering disability. And I'm concerned about that. So I'd much rather start from a position where I've already centered disability and kind of work from there. So that's why I'm going to start with what might seem like counterintuitive concepts from Nietzsche's philosophy, where instead of discussing health, I'm going to discuss some of his ethical thought. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is first of all lay out some key concepts in the philosophy of disability, since I'm aware that not everyone might be familiar with this work. Before I do that, I'm just going to briefly note to you what the key claims are that I'm going to make in this talk. So the claims I'm really going to defend here. First, that our thinking about the ethical may itself constitute a barrier to eliminating what Reynolds calls the ableist conflation from philosophy, and in particular our attachment to what Nietzsche terms customary morality, or Sittlichkeit der Sitte in Dawn Aphorism 9, might prove to be an unseen yet quite significant barrier to the ongoing task of eliminating the ableist conflation. So with those in mind, let me talk then a little bit about some recent concepts from philosophy of disability. So there are 4 of these, and I'm going to take them in turn. Each of these is going to raise a challenge to ableism, both in medicine and healthcare and in wider society, and also in the context of philosophy. And so these are quite helpful ways of thinking through the centering of disability that I was discussing earlier. So first of all, we'll turn to some work by Elizabeth Barnes. In her 2016 book, The Minority Body, A Theory of Disability, Elizabeth Barnes discusses the mere difference view of disability, which she defines as the view that having a disability makes you different, but that the disability by itself doesn't necessarily make you worse off. Barnes defends a version of a mere difference view of disability that she calls a value-neutral model of disability, which view she grounds in the testimony of disabled people who value their disabilities. And according to Barnes's value-neutral model of disability, one can value the feature on the whole, even while some bad effects of the feature may exist. A value-neutral feature may be good for some aspects of your life, yet bad for other aspects of your life. The key point to note is that for Barnes, disability is not an essential negative. Disability can, and the testimony of disabled people shows that it can be something that carries positive value. So that was concept number 1. Secondly, in a 2019 paper, David Peña-Guzman and Joe Michael Reynolds differentiate between the medical and social models of disability. As they point out, a root cause of ableism in medicine is medicine's own understanding of disability as an objective lack, rather than as a diverse set of phenomena that are thoroughly socially mediate. As they claim, the medical model of disability views disability as a personal tragedy or a hardship resulting from a congenital abnormality, an environmental accident, or a result of old age. In contrast, as they explain, the social model of disability enables a core distinction to be made between disability and impairment. On the social model of disability, a person is impaired insofar as their body is different in ways that impact their ability to function in the world as compared to most people, whereas a person is disabled insofar as they are negatively impacted by the treatment of others on account of their impairment, including through impacts that arise owing to larger societal norms and institutions. So this is the second concept that I'm thinking through and using in terms of this talk. Thirdly, in a 2018 paper which focuses on phenomenology and disability, Joel Michael Reynolds has developed a phenomenology of disability, or of what he calls the non-normate body, through attention to the work of Merleau-Ponty. As he discusses in her 1997 book, Extraordinary Bodies, Figuring Physical Disability in American Culture and Literature, Rosemary Garland Thompson defined the normate body as the veiled subject position of the cultural self, the figure outlined by the array of deviant others whose marked bodies shore up the normate's boundaries. The term normate usefully designates the social figure through which people can represent themselves as definitive human beings. Reynolds argues that the pair, normate, non-normate, better picks out the range and lived context of meanings captured by that of ability, disability. And as Reynolds suggests, by fusing norms, values, and desires, the concept of the normate brings into relief the way in which categorization by ability is irreducibly social, and how powers and histories are always at play in the constitution of any given ability or disability. And I'm really interested in Reynolds' use of phenomenology in his work. And I did not have time to discuss this in depth here, but Christine Daigle has been at work on a book that is now forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press, entitled Nietzsche as Phenomenologist. And I think that part of my broader project is going to involve looking at Daigle's work on Nietzsche's, as she terms it, wild existential phenomenology, and seeing how that phenomenological approach to understanding Nietzsche can be useful in the context of thinking about the relevance of his work to understanding and thinking through disability. So here's finally, fourthly, the concept from philosophy of disability that I'm planning to discuss a little more in this paper. So this is the ableist conflation, and as Joel Michael Reynolds remarks, it's something that he thinks is seriously misguided. So he's not defending the ableist conflation, he's tracing out what this concept is and what it does. So Reynolds defines the highly problematic ableist conflation as resulting from, at minimum, the following set of claims. First, understanding disability as a lack or deprivation. Second, the idea that deprivation of potential goods is a harm. Thirdly, harm causes or is a form of pain and suffering. And fourthly, given the first 3 points, disability is coextensive with or causes pain and suffering. So according to Reynolds, thinking through these claims, the ableist conflation is the persistent and wrongful conflation of experiences of disability with experiences of pain, suffering, and disadvantage. And as Reynolds points out, there is an enormous body of research across disability studies that demonstrates the ableist conflation to be misguided, if not flatly false, in a plethora of cases of disabled experience. According to Reynolds, the history of philosophy has been heavily influenced by the ableist conflation, understood as a habit of thought. He suggests that if philosophy is to combat ableism, then the ableist conflation must be destroyed. So in the longer version of this essay, I discuss all 4 of these concepts in more depth, Here I'm going to focus more on the second and the fourth, particularly the ableist conflation as a problem for us. And today I want specifically to suggest that our thinking about the ethical itself may constitute a barrier to the elimination of the ableist conflation from philosophy, especially with regard to the social constitution of disability and the embeddedness of the concepts and of people's lived experiences within relations of power. If correct, this would indicate that our social attachment to what Nietzsche calls customary morality might prove an unseen yet significant barrier to the ongoing task of eliminating the ableist conflation. I often think if one's looking for destructive power, Nietzsche is a good point of contact. So in pursuit of destructive power with an eye to reconstruction, I'm going to turn now to thinking about Susan Stocker's work on Nietzsche and disability. So in a 2002 paper, Susan Stocker presented an analysis of Nietzsche's relevance to disability and to non-normate bodies. Stocker examines Nietzsche's thinking in specific relation to her own personal experience of injury, rehabilitation, and disability, contrasting Nietzsche's thinking on pity and power with Aristotle's thinking on empathy. Stocker discusses how the ethical begins in what she calls the throes of lived human experience. She focuses on the experience of rehabilitation and examining how the history of philosophy can contribute to our understanding of disability. As Stocker explains, she experienced serious mobility challenges for 2.5 years, first using crutches and then a wheelchair full-time for another 8 months. She assesses how she encountered two distinct but related philosophical concepts through this experience. First, she describes experiencing empowering empathy, a concept that she draws from Aristotle that, according to her, refers to an interest in, attunement to, and responsiveness to the subjective inner experience of the other at a cognitive and affective level. Second, she describes experiencing what she says Nietzsche and rehabilitation professionals understand as a pity that is demeaning for both the pitied and the pitier. So for both the pitier and the one person who is being pitied. To illustrate this, she takes an example from disability pride activism, namely the well-known slogan, "Piss on Pity." And she thinks that both Aristotle's empowering empathy and Nietzsche's demeaning pity can be drawn together to perform a project that she refers to as facing disability. So Stocker finds Nietzsche's critique of Mitleid, and when we're thinking of Mitleid, there are difficulties with translation. So you could be thinking of pity, you could be thinking of compassion. In discussion of the ongoing translation project of Nietzsche's works, Alan Schrift, for example, has tried to separate those two concepts out and to focus more on compassion. Gudrun von Tevener has also done some important work on how best we can translate Mitleid and how well translations map onto different aphorisms in Nietzsche's works. So I mention this so I'm not glossing over those difficulties. And because of those difficulties, I'm going to continue generally to use the term Mitleid for the moment. Stocker translates Mitleid as pity. She defines Nietzsche's critique of Mitleid as a response to vulnerability, in which our independence from others is highlighted. And she argues that what Nietzsche shows us is that of particular importance is that we can preserve our self-determination as an emotional and moral option, free from either a malingering self-pity or a hankering for pity from others. She also claims that when Aristotelian empathic enlargement is available to us, we can respond joyfully, But when it is not available, we can respond with the vitality of what is our own, with strength and without seeking pity. According to Stocker, Nietzsche recommends saying and affirming yes to our lives, suffering and all. Only the rancorous emotions are put down as symptoms of a pathetic, life-denying will to power. Instead, she claims what we owe to others is our own vitality, a life-affirming will to power. And as part of her argument, Stocker acknowledges Nietzsche's own experience with respect to disability, such as the experience of debilitating migraines. And of Nietzsche's position, Stocker writes that his experiences clearly had an effect on his philosophy. So she writes, the external good of health, once lost, had to be interpreted as what was really not his own. This turn towards a fresh evaluation of what one really needs in order to make life worthwhile is characteristic of those facing disability. It is immensely life-affirming to let go of one's imperiled expectations for near-perfect or even normal embodiment. However, Nietzsche's Stoicism overshoots the mark. No matter how much mind control we muster, we cannot make ourselves as invulnerable to external goods as all this. And she writes, I also worry Nietzsche's Stoicism delegitimizes all moral indignation as life-denying reactive ressentiment. For this can also just be a fancy escape route from uncomfortable moral claims. So I think Stocker is right to consider Nietzsche's standpoint in relation to disability. We already know, and many Nietzsche scholars have written about Nietzsche's comments on things like diet, exercise, daily practices. And in fact, in another project that I'm writing for a book edited by John Altman and Melinda Hall, claiming the canon philosophy's crip history, I'm examining the case for understanding Nietzsche as a disabled philosopher. So I do think that she's right to try to do that piece of work. I also think that her claim that life affirmation can flow from abandonment of expectations for near perfect or normate embodiment is somewhere along the right track. But I do also have some worries about how her argument works. I'm concerned about the point she makes about Nietzsche as delegitimizing all moral indignation as life-denying. I don't think that's framed quite right. And the reason for that is I worry that it conflates the ethical with the customary moral. Nietzsche very clearly distinguishes between those two ways of thinking about the ethical. Particularly in his free spirit writings, and I'm going to say more about that later on. My other worry, though, is that when I look at how much of Stocker's project is actually supported by references to Nietzsche, it's a little bit sparse. She only uses 3 pieces of textual evidence from Nietzsche to support her analysis, and those pieces are Gay Science 290, Beyond Good and Evil 43, and Beyond Good and Evil 44. None of them really seem to me to get that much critical analysis. So I found myself in a curious position, on the one hand finding some of her remarks very helpful, on the other hand having some concerns about them. And I think in part, and it's important I think to read charitably, any account engaging both historical and contemporary resources and problematics is going to face a similar challenge. I'm certainly aware of that challenge myself here. But I think it's also very important to try to do that work. So what I propose to do now is to briefly examine those aphorisms in turn and to try to expand on the analysis that Stocker offers. So with respect to Gay Science 290, which receives the most detailed analysis, Stocker quotes the following excerpt from the aphorism. She writes, and many of you who are Nietzsche scholars will be familiar with this, one thing is needful, that a human being should attain satisfaction with himself, whether it be by means of this or that poetry or art. Only then is a human being at all tolerable to behold. Whoever is dissatisfied with himself is ready for revenge. We others will be his victims, if only by having to endure his ugly sight. So Stocker presents this claim from Gay Science 290 as a remark by Nietzsche on the importance of learning to experience what she calls loss or thwartedness without resenting it. I think that claim needs some refinement. So Nietzsche's point on self-satisfaction is preceded in Gay Science 290 by the point that to give style to one's character is a great and rare art. And as Paul Franco has emphasized, the artistry that Nietzsche discusses in this aphorism puts the emphasis on working with and arranging the natural aspects of ourselves. In the same way that artists work with what they're given, even if it is ugly, focusing on transformation rather than denial. Nietzsche writes in this aphorism that the great and rare art is practiced by those, quote, who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weakness delights the eye. And he makes it clear a little later in the aphorism that his sense of weakness here refers to weak characters without power over themselves, who hate the constraint of style. So that claim, I think, needs some refinement. Stocker then goes on to discuss Beyond Good and Evil 43 and 44 as part of examining Nietzsche's critique of Mitleid. She claims that for Nietzsche, pity, and again, that's how she's translating Mitleid, is mistaken because 1, it wrongly affirms external goods as important. 2, pity misaligns faults as lying elsewhere instead of with oneself. And she writes, anyone with the Nietzschean virtues evaluates accordingly and without self-pity. 3, identifying with the supposed good of others is, quote, putrid, since there are no common goods. Stocker's support for that third claim here is from Beyond Good and Evil 43, and she quotes the following portion of the aphorism. She writes, good is no longer good when one's neighbour mouths it. And how should that be a common good? The term contradicts itself. Whatever can be common always has little value. Stocker also argues that Nietzsche disparages pity, since it's a pretense that, quote, life should be easy and that hardships are a misfortune. She also claims, paraphrasing Beyond Good and Evil 44, that Nietzsche chastises those pathetic moralists who insist on security and comfort and an easier life for everyone, because suffering itself they take for something that must be abolished. She further claims, though I could not find reference to either Genealogy of Morals or to Twilight Maxims 8, which, as far as I can see, she paraphrases but doesn't cite, that, quote, the herd would rid us of conditions that actually enhance our species. Whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And again, many of you will be familiar that Twilight Maxims 8 actually reads from the military school of life, whatever does not kill me makes me stronger. It's an often decontextualized quotation from Nietzsche. And again, in the longer version of this essay, I try to give it some context, both in relation to Nietzsche's projects and in relation to his life. So I want to suggest, having talked about those 3 pieces of textual evidence that Stocker uses, is that the use of Beyond Good and Evil is actually a bit more problematic. Why so? It neglects the context of the aphorisms within the second chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, which is entitled, again, as many of you know, The Free Spirit. And it also neglects the wider context of Nietzsche's campaign against customary morality, out of which his critique of Mitleid and of a morality grounded in compassion is developed. And moreover, I worry that since Stocker had suggested that disability essentially constitutes a loss or a thwarting in some of the claims here, she's inadvertently reinscribing what Reynolds had termed the ableist conflation. And I'm not alone in having that worry, even though there are very many helpful pieces of her argument, that there's also that worry about that reinscription going on. A similar worry about Stocker's work was raised in a 2010 paper by Joe Stramondo, who's taken issue with Stocker's analysis on the basis that it accounted for Nietzsche's account of pity, and for pity in the context of disability, in terms of individual emotion, rather than in terms of what he considers far more important with respect to disability, power differentials in social contexts. And as Stramondo points out, for pity to exist, one group must have more power than another. And he says a power differential is a necessary condition for pity, and also that the power differential is what creates harm in the case of pity. I found Stramondo's critique very helpful. At the same time, I note that he didn't then go on to examine Nietzsche's views in detail as part of developing his critique of Stocker's views on pity. Instead, what he does, and it is super interesting actually, he uses Sartre's anti-Semite and Jew, and in particular Sartre's discussion of the relationship between pity and the creation of categories of racial oppression, in order to expand on an account of the problem that pity poses to our understanding of disability. So I do think this account is helpful, and I agree with Stramondo that what makes pity in the context of disability problematic is that pity constitutes social harm to disabled people. Yet Stramondo also claims that rather than attending to the minutiae of moral psychology, we would do better to attend to social power relations to understand the harm of pity and its use as a tool of oppression. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with him wholly about that. I agree with why he's claiming that, but I think that moral psychology can do a bit more than it's being given credit for through Nietzsche. So to that end, what I'm hoping to do here now is to give a brief examination of Nietzsche's thinking on Mitleid and power. That will help to clarify why Nietzsche's moral psychology, in which power relations and power differentials are attended to, may have a bit more of a role to play in the philosophy of disability, and may potentially be able to help with addressing the problem of the ableist conflation. Let me just see where I am with slides. Yes, I think I can put that there. Okay, so pause for tea break. Let me think then with you a bit about Nietzsche's challenge to customary morality and his critique of Mitleid. So now I want to try to support my proposal, which I mentioned earlier, that our thinking about the ethical may itself constitute a barrier to the elimination of the ableist conflation from philosophy. So I'm going to present a discussion of customary morality and Mitleid, drawing on work that Keith Ensel Pearson and I published in our 2020 book. And I will have a few things to say about power relationships as part of this. So in our book, Ensel Pearson and I discussed how the primary ethical project embedded within Dawn is the development of a substantial challenge to what Nietzsche terms customary morality, or Sittlichkeit der Sitte, which is set alongside Nietzsche's development of a set of experimental, playful aphorisms that encourage exploration of new ethical alternatives to customary morality and to its ethic of compassion. Customary morality problematically inhibits us from having new experiences, from correcting old and harmful customs, and from developing new and better customs. In short, customary morality gets in the way of humans being human beings. Of course, somebody might point out, well, that might appear to be the point of customary morality. After all, humans do dreadful things sometimes. However, as Nietzsche points out in Dawn, the feeling for custom is not based as clearly on what is perceived to be useful or harmful to humans as might be assumed, but is rather based on the age-induced sanctity of the custom, as he writes in Dawn 19. Nietzsche suggests that our obedience to traditions and moral customs is made far more consistent through our susceptibility to a special type of superstitious fear, which arises for us out of concern for the consequences of transgressing against an inexplicable, indeterminate power, which he writes about in Dawn 9. We claimed, and I've also discussed in independent work as well, that the superstitious fear that arises is best understood as a mood, because our fear of transgression against an unseen and unknowable power isn't ultimately directed towards one single action or event, but rather surrounds us and frames all of our moral reflections and experiences. As Ansel Pearson and I also showed, in order to mount a successful challenge or campaign against customary morality, Nietzsche's survey of the problem in the first book of Dawn shows that a way must be found to counter three specific issues. First, when considered from the perspective of customary morality and its socially entrenched authority, a project devoted to challenging that morality is deemed immoral. Undertaking such a project is therefore likely to be inhibited in or rejected by anyone concerned by the possibility of experiencing moral censure. Second, this problem is made much more complex and difficult to overcome by the seductive power of the language of morality. Pointing to the confusion caused by words, Nietzsche reminds us that we only have words for superlative aspects of psychophysical processes and drives, such as compassion, and not for milder or lower processes and drives, which form our characters even though we are unaware of them. Third, customary morality promotes a mood of fear among us, which further inhibits possible challenges to its authority. In Nietzsche's discussions of the individual moral agent, substantial attention is given to the relationship between the individual and other individuals in social context. In a later aphorism, for example, Dawn 467, Nietzsche explores why mitleid might contribute to an agent's need for forbearance or patience, which he characterizes as forbearance twice. The aphorism asks us to consider how someone may warn us that you will cause a lot of people pain that way. As we consider taking a specific action, the aphorism suggests the following reply to the imagined interlocutor: I know it and know as well that I will suffer doubly for it, once from compassion with their suffering, and then from the revenge they will take on me. Nevertheless, it is no less necessary to act as I am acting. This indicates not only that Nietzsche envisages how the possible ethics of self-fashioning of agents are embedded in a web of social connections, but also how this embeddedness and the agent's understanding of it is shaped by the ethic of compassion as a part of customary morality. Henry Statton, in his 1990 book, as well as Ansel Pearson and myself in various papers, as well as the 2020 book, have discussed Dawn 113 as an example of an aphorism in which the power relations amongst empathic agents are made apparent by Nietzsche. There, as we've discussed, Nietzsche argues that the empathy in being in the know that the drive for distinction requires is not harmless or compassionate or benevolent, and is better understood as the striving for domination. Any joy experienced through the striving for domination is brought about by someone having placed their imprint on the soul of another person. Nietzsche's connection to his discussion of Mitleid and an account of the functioning of drives is also relevant here. For example, in Dawn 119, which he clearly prefaces when he identifies striving for distinction as a drive at the beginning of aphorism 113. This underlines why Nietzsche finds the idea that we're united by Mitleid to be ultimately implausible, and also helps us to see why he thinks that it might be worthwhile for us to risk the possible suffering of others and the censure of customary morality, as well as to risk our own suffering by challenging customary morality. In addition, as Ansel Pearson and I argue, and as I've discussed again in several other publications, Nietzsche suggests that moral feelings are socially transmitted through mood. There are lots of examples of this. As Nietzsche discusses, for example, while living in accordance with customary morality, we communicate to our neighbours a mood or a frame of mind in which our neighbour sees themselves as a sacrifice. And he writes, we talk him, so our neighbour, into the task for which we wish to use him. In this case, do we lack compassion? But if we wish to also get beyond our compassion and to gain a victory over ourselves, does not this constitute a higher and freer bearing and attitude than when one feels safe once one has ascertained whether an action benefits or hurts one's neighbour? So here Nietzsche suggests that while we may be under the impression that Mitleid is a humanising moral feeling, it is in fact a dehumanising and hypocritical dimension of customary morality. This form of morality involves each individual in playing a functional role within the self-sustaining economy of moral custom. The individual turns his or her neighbours into creatures who think of themselves as obedient at best and as potential sacrifices for the alleged moral benefit of their community at worst. Everyone remains superstitiously afraid of contravening custom, incurring divine wrath, and garnering negative consequences for one's community. As Nietzsche suggests, this is a narrow and petty bourgeois morality. In contrast to this form of morality, a higher and freer way of thinking would look beyond immediate consequences and work towards more distant aims, such as furthering human knowledge and moral understanding, even if doing so comes at the cost of others' suffering. As Nietzsche goes on to argue, we would, through sacrifice, in which we and our neighbours are included, strengthen and elevate the feeling of human power, even though we might achieve nothing further, but even this would be a positive increase in happiness, from Dawn 146. The we of whom Nietzsche speaks in this remark are, of course, not to be understood as members of our current community, who are bound together by a morality of compassion. Rather, the we in this aphorism refer to new possible ethical agents who are focused on self-fashioning and who, as an emergent possible community of the future, are engaged in throwing off old values, including Mitleid and the power of Mitleid, and who are active experimenters with new values. And so with this in mind, this is, I think, where Stocker's emphasis on Beyond Good and Evil 43 and 44 turns out to be relevant, but yet just a little bit wide of its mark, given the emphasis that she placed on the individual instead of the social. So here, let me just talk a little bit about these aphorisms to make that point clear. So in Beyond Good and Evil 43, we can see that Nietzsche writes, and this is the piece that Stocker had referred to, good is no longer good when one's neighbour mouths it, and how should there be a common good? The term contradicts itself. Whatever can be common always has little value. What Stocker misses, and what I want to connect with the discussion of Mitleid that I've just presented, is the context of this remark, which is philosophers of the future. What Nietzsche is doing when he makes that remark isn't just kind of throwing away a point about pity and common good. He's actually doing work as part of his Free Spirit project, looking back at that project and earlier works. And he also goes on here to write, of those philosophers of the future, the potential ones, it is certain they will not be dogmatists. It would surely go against their pride and also against their good taste if their truth had to be a truth for everyone else too. So the context here, I think, really matters. Why does it matter? Again, because what we're trying to make sure happens is that we separate out the customary morality discussion of Mitleid from potential new ethical considerations that the Free Spirit Project makes possible. And so we can see that in Beyond Good and Evil 43 and 44, and indeed in the wider parts of part 2 of Beyond Good and Evil, what Nietzsche is discussing, and it comes out in other texts too, but I'll focus on Beyond Good and Evil for now, is what Amy Mullen called an experimental developmental trajectory of the free spirit. So in Beyond Good and Evil 44, for example, we get a mention of levelers who are, it's a reference to people who are wrongly named free spirits. They're not free at all. In fact, Nietzsche says they're a very narrow, trapped and chained sort of spirit who wants more or less the opposite of what we do. He describes them as loquacious, scribbling slaves of the democratic taste and its modern ideas, seekers of comfort via the often recited tunes and teachings of equal rights and compassion for all suffering. So it's very clear that he's worried here about use of compassion as something that isn't as liberatory as we might assume it is. In comparison, we have free spirits who, again, in the same aphorism, Nietzsche discusses as being at home, or at least a guest, in many countries of the spirit, having again and again escaped the pleasant, overstuffed nooks to which our special loves and hatreds, our youth, our origins, the accidents of people and books, or even the weariness of the journey have seemed to banish us. The free spirits are a waypoint towards very free spirits, or the philosophers of the future, who will not be free spirits merely, but something more, higher, greater, fundamentally different, something that would not go unrecognized or misidentified. And in later works, as Andreas S. Sommer has pointed out, there's also mention of freed spirits, frei gewordene Geister. So there is a trajectory of free-spirited development in which the type of agent, the ethical agent, moves away from their dependence upon a morality grounded in compassion and moves towards experimentation and development of new values. And although I think Stocker was right in her thinking to point to these texts, she doesn't really bring out this experimental development trajectory at all. And she doesn't clearly tie what she's claiming to the wider context of what Nietzsche wants to accomplish in his work. And I think that her project would actually be much stronger had she done that. So with that in mind, if we recontextualize what has been done by Nietzsche in this context, we're going to gain a couple of things. We're going to gain more awareness of the power relations embedded within Nietzsche's campaign against customary morality and the critique of Mitleid. And that helps us, I think, potentially to challenge the ableist conflation and push back on the idea that, for instance, all suffering is necessarily bad, or that anything to do with disability is a lack, a loss, or a matter of suffering. What Nietzsche does, in short, is show us what's harmful and disempowering about Mitleid. So with that in mind, I just, in conclusion, have a few thoughts to raise about concerns and potential ways of responding to them. Some people might have some worries about the kind of line of thinking about reassessment of the ethical that I've been outlining. One of those might be worries about ableism within Nietzsche's philosophy. And though I haven't had time here to set out all of the possible examples, there are some, including in his self-descriptions as well as in his use of figurative examples in his philosophy. The second worry is about uses to which Nietzsche's philosophy can be put. For example, somebody could, and people did, use Nietzsche's philosophy to defend something like a discriminatory eugenics. So to push back a little bit about those concerns, it's not that I don't think they're serious, I do, but I think that we can respond to them in a way that encourages us to keep going forward with considering Nietzsche as having something to say here. First of all, I would turn to some work by Ophelia Schutter. She has spent a great deal of time examining Nietzsche's relevance to projects of liberation, including liberation from colonialism, its continuing legacy worldwide, liberation from androcentrism. And she points out Nietzsche can be very helpful. Nietzsche alone is clearly insufficient to take us where we want to go politically. But at the same time, she points out that given her own experiences with Latin American and feminist liberation movements, she wouldn't want to take the journey without Nietzsche. Because, as she notes, there's a risk that a liberation movement may become a self-righteous moral and political force, in which case it would fall right back into the kind of customary morality that Nietzsche has pointed out is so problematic. To mitigate that risk, she recommends a strong dose of Nietzschean undermining of absolutes. She thinks that by rejecting binary oppositional thinking in the political context, as Nietzsche does, we can respond to danger pragmatically without involving an ideology of danger as inextricably linked to evil and of liberation from danger as linked to good. That allows us to support resistance to manipulation of the masses through rhetoric, and allows us to develop resistance to our ethical and political thinking becoming automatic or unreflective. And I think that some of her points in this regard are helpful to allaying concerns that might well arise regarding Nietzsche's own ableism, as well as use of Nietzsche to advance anti-ableist goals, so to try to challenge the ableist conflation. The other text that I would turn to is work by Stephen Smith. And he has defended an account of Nietzsche as what he calls a surprising ally to the disability rights movement. And he points out, rightly, I think, that claims for equal rights that are often advanced in all liberatory movements, including disability rights, are misaligned with Nietzsche. Why, as we saw in the quotations from Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche tends to equate calls for equal rights with customary morality. And Nietzsche critiques that, as we've seen. Ansel Pierce and I argued in our 2020 book that we could potentially, at least within the context of Dawn, I would say potentially also to Beyond Good and Evil, separate out engagement in political therapy from calls for equal rights, especially those calling or relying on universalism or some kind of essentialism. But Smith, even acknowledging that piece is a problem, also points out that there are other areas of Nietzsche that are potentially very useful to disability rights movements. So, for example, he gives 4. Nietzsche's anti-essentialism, the critique of pity and compassion, which I've discussed, critiques of ideals and dualism, and also Nietzsche's eternal recurrence thesis as linked to notions of individual empowerment and identity assertion. So I've been really focused on the critique of pity and compassion, but there's a lot more work to be done in thinking through those other possibilities and drawing out both political and ethical concerns. So just to conclude then, I've been thinking about customary morality, and in particular Nietzsche's thinking about an ethic of compassion or Mitleid as a key feature of that kind of morality, as a potential source for the ableist conflation. And I've tried to connect, first of all, Nietzsche's thinking to contemporary philosophy of disability, and to show that customary morality may constitute a barrier to the elimination of the ableist conflation from philosophy. So thank you very much. and I really appreciate the opportunity to hear some constructive feedback. Thank you.